Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar where we will talk about how to level up your demand planning process and boost forecast accuracy with leading indicator forecasting. I'm Deborah Braquet, Sales and Marketing Manager for SOLVENTURE LIFe, and today's speakers are Associate Professor Nikolaos Kourentzes from Lancaster University and Professor Dr. Bram Desmet from Vlerik University and also CEO of SOLVENTURE. All right, so SOLVENTURE LIFe, who are we? What do we do? At SOLVENTURE LIFe, we're specialized in advanced predictive analytics. So over the past 5 years, we've conducted a lot of research, and we have a few PhD researchers in our team who have been looking into how external information can improve the forecasting process and the business planning process. And what we've seen is by including external factors, we improve the forecast accuracy, but we also gain a lot of insights in how the market environment looks like and what are really the demand drivers for your sales. So what we've done is we've built a tool where we gather global data from various data providers like the FRED, OECD, Eurostat, National Bureau of Statistics of China, global indicators. And up till now, we have more than 2 million global indicators in our data pool. And what we then do is really connect your sales with those global indicators. And the tool itself detects which indicators are relevant for your business. And we will then use that information to build forecast models and help you improve business planning processes. And what we've seen is that in different types of industries, we see different types of influences from external factors. So, for example, in FMCG and retail industries, promotions will have a big influence. So it's really important and crucial that you take that information into account when you do your demand planning processes. On the other hand, when we look at chemical types of industries, we see a big influence from macroeconomic factors, which are having a big role there in driving the demand. So these different types of industries have different types of significant effects from external information, and you really have to dig in deeper and look what are relevant external informations and external drivers for your business. And as you see, we are represented, or we have customers across these different types of industries. So we're present in more food and CPG types of companies, but also in chemical, automotive, and much more. Then SOLVENTURE LIFe is part of the SOLVENTURE business, and SOLVENTURE has also other services and products within his product map. For example, also the SOLVENTURE SNOP business unit focuses on sales and operations planning processes. So what we do there is really a software-based consultancy where we improve the sales and operations planning process by focusing on 4 main pillars. So we look at tools, analytics, people, and process to really improve that sales and operations process. And then there's also the SOLVENTURE Academy, which is our training institute, where we train in different topics in the supply chain field. So we have different types of products. We have accelerator days, which are 1-day trainings on a specific topic, for example, demand planning. But we also host boost camps, which are really tailor-made trainings for your company needs. So if you want more information, visit our website, solventuregroup.com, or don't hesitate to get in touch for some questions. Okay, so let's start. I will give the word to Bram now, and he will further elaborate on why you should be taking promotions and events into account.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Good. So to introduce the topic of today, I want to start with a recent case we have been analyzing for a second-tier supplier to the automotive. And this is a case about sales in China, which we've also discovered is a specific topic of interest for a lot of companies, because if it's already difficult to understand European and US markets, then the Chinese market is certainly even more difficult to understand. So you see that we have sales data from 2013 up to mid 2017. And okay, if this is the actual sales and you try to look at the sales history, what kind of strikes you is that if you look at 2013 till 2016, there seems to be a kind of an increasing trend. And then somewhere second quarter of 2016, it seems like the sales makes a jump. So you see a big peak over here. And it's like, it's less clear like what is happening now. At least the levels seem to have shifted. So if the level was around this line, clearly the levels seem to have shifted to a new type of line. And when we make forecasts of this type of sales pattern, the question is, of course, like, what does the forecast look like based on this history? In the LIFe tool, we make forecasts taking into account macroeconomic indicators. And the main theme we want to discuss today is like, okay, before you can look for macroeconomic indicators, you may need to filter off some events. Events could be promotions, could be effects of weather, but it could also be other effects. So if we wouldn't filter off any events, well, most probably we see an increasing trend here. At least we see a jump in the level since Q2 2016. If we don't filter anything out, most probably we are looking for indicators which can explain, on the one hand, the trend from 2013 till 2016, and then the jump in Q2 2016. That's probably what we would be looking for. But okay, when we have been discussing this time series with the customer, it's clear that there's more at play, and actually that's explained here in this graph or at this slide. Also, when doing the modeling, we saw that there are two effects. First of all, that big jump in sales here, the first semester in 2016, but it's not really January, February, it's so say March till June, July 2016. That jump in the sales, in fact, is due to a pre-buying effect. There had been an announced price increase in the market, and what you see is that customers and distributors will start buying more because of the announced price increase, either in your goods or in key raw materials. So part of that uplift in 2016 is not, let us say, a structural shift in the market. No, it's rather the effect of pre-buying because of an announced price increase. And we have that effect here in 2016. We have a comparable effect the beginning of 2017. There again, an increase in prices was announced, which leads to customers and distributors pre-buying some of your product and material. A second effect, which we typically have to deal with, certainly for Chinese data, is the effect of Chinese New Year. And what you see is that, well, Chinese New Year in 2014 was really January. In 2015, it was February. In 2016, it was again February. And in 2017, Chinese New Year was in January. So you see that Chinese New Year is an example of shifting calendar seasonality. It's like Easter in Europe. Easter is not always in the same month. You have the same for Chinese New Year. And if you don't clean for that type of historical events, you will typically have a blurred estimate of your calendar seasonality. That's also what Nikos will show in his presentation. The interesting thing, though, is here the following. You see that, okay, you see the downward peak in the sales in 2015. You see the downward peak of the sales in 2016. You see that in 2017, the downward peak of Chinese New Year is less deep. It's less steep. How does that come? It actually has to do with the combined effect of, on the one hand, having Chinese New Year, which has a downward peak because you are closed and your customers are closed, but you have that pre-buying effect. So the combination of Chinese New Year and the pre-buying effect means that the downward peak of Chinese New Year is less steep or less deep compared to earlier years. If you don't take off this kind of variability, it will end up in the leading indicator. And well, clearly here for this type of sales pattern, if there are some known effects like Chinese New Year pre-buying effects, you really want to first take them off the time series before you start looking for the matching macroeconomic indicators. And that's what you see here. So If we would not remove these effects, then we would stick to the gray sales curve. By removing the effects, we reveal the underlying black cleaned time series. So that's kind of the sales where we have controlled for the effect of the pre-buying and of Chinese New Year. And if you would then from that black sales curve remove the remaining seasonality, then you come to the red curve. So that's really the underlying trend that you reveal. And you see here that, well, 2013, there has been an increasing trend that has flattened out a bit beginning of 2014. So here the trend is a bit more flat. In 2015, you see that the trend is picking up again and the growth is accelerating again. And then in 2016, it's flattening out a little bit. And what we then really do in the macroeconomic part of life is find matching indicators for that red curve. How do we do that? We will not discuss in detail, but there's different options. So we have our database of plus 2 million indicators, so we can do a brute force analysis. We can also refine the search and only look for indicators containing specific keywords, or we could even take 5 or 10 indicators which you are currently using to see what kind of model would make best use of those 5 or 10 current indicators that you are currently using. In this case, we have been looking at a subset of a couple of thousand indicators which were indicated on the one hand on keywords and also enriched by some company specific information. And this is what came out as the optimal model. So you see that the oil price plays a role, and it has a negative impact, meaning that if the oil price goes down, my sales will go up. You see that there is a second and a third indicator, company specific, with a positive relationship. So basically, if the indicator goes up, my sales will go up. And there is a fourth indicator, which again has a negative relationship. So if that indicator goes down, and my sales goes up, and vice versa. You also see the different lags. So the first and the third indicator have a lag 12. So that's really a long and a strong predictive power. The last has a lag 6, which means it still allows us to enrich our forecast in the 3 to 6 month horizon. And there is one indicator which has a lag 1, so that allows us to improve next month's forecast. Not necessarily what we are looking for in an S&P context, but okay, at least we know which indicators are explaining at which horizon, and we can build forecasting models based on that. So if we build this type of forecasting models, what we do is, well, we can say, well, let's just assume that we have data up till July 2016. What if we would then make a forecast from August 2016 till July 2017? So we make a 1 year ahead forecast. The red forecast is the live forecast, so that's the leading indicator forecast, taking into account the pre-buying effect and the effect of Chinese New Year. And Nikos also in his presentation will talk about more traditional extrapolation methods like the Holt-Winters method. And the challenge with those traditional methods is, for instance, that you need to identify, do you want to work with the recent trend or do you want to work with the long-term trend? And if we only have data till July 2016, well, if you look at the recent trend, because there is a big peak here in the sales, and in the meantime, we know it's a pre-buying effect. But in traditional techniques, you cannot define external effects. Then the Holt-Winters will see it as a trend. So if you really look at the recent history, because of the big peak here in the first semester of 2016, it will predict a strongly increasing trend. So the Holt-Winters with the recent trend will lead to that green forecast. If you look at the long-term trend, then you would really look at the trend starting from 2013. That long-term trend will be more mild, as you see it. So that will be more a moderate trend that leads to the blue curve, the blue forecast. On the right here, we show the forecast error. So the mean percentage error, that means are we over forecasting or under forecasting? The mean absolute percentage error, or the MAPI, tells us on how accurate is the forecast in a specific month. And you see that the live forecast not only easily outperforms the two traditional forecasts on both error metrics. The problem we also see in companies that, like, okay, if you ask salespeople, they typically have a short-term memory. So if the sales has been very good in the first half of 2016, they are more tempted to predict that recent trend, that recent level, so they will typically end up with that green forecast. But sometimes the recent trend will be better, sometimes the longer term trend will be better. Basically, that's one of the shortcomings of traditional models. You need to make a choice, but the choice is not always the same. And you clearly see that working with leading indicators kind of relieves you from that choice, because we are better able to look at historical trend changes and look at which type of indicators kind of better predict trend changes also towards the future. So you see that live forecast is better here. So I will basically pass on here to Nikos. The example we have shown or the example we have shown as an introduction here is primarily meant to show that, okay, you need to reveal the underlying trend, but to reveal the underlying trend, you need to take off events. And events in this case were shifting seasonality being Chinese New Year, and an event in this case was also a pre-buying effect because of an announced price increase. But it could also be changes in import tariffs, it could also be promotions, it could also be effects of weathers. You first need to remove these type of effects to be able to really reveal the underlying trend and the underlying trend changes. We forecast that underlying trend using macroeconomic indicators. And then, of course, when we make the forecast towards the future, we can put known effects back on. So seasonality is known. If you know about promotions, we can put it on. If you know about new import tariff changes, we can put that back on. And how we deal with weather, that's basically what I will discuss. Weather is certainly one of the variables where you might historically see there is a strong dependency, but you don't know the weather like for the next year or so. So even if there is a dependency on weather, how do we then deal with weather towards the future? That's one of the questions which I want to tackle in the last part of this webinar. And the first thing I want to do is I want to start with an example which was probably my first encounter with how important weather dependency can be. And it's, on the one hand, it could be an obvious example, but in the end I will tell you which product it is. And I didn't expect this product to be so weather dependent. So it comes from a retail environment. It's point of sale data, it's daily sales, and we will see daily sales for 9 months of a historical year. So the black curve is really the historical sales, right? And what you see is you see clearly a pattern. In fact, we will see later on that's the weekly pattern. So retailers will sell less on Monday and Tuesday, and they will typically sell more in the weekend. So Friday evening is important, Saturday is very important. And you also see changes throughout the year. So you see that some periods sales is increasing. You see large peak here. This is really more the summer period. So the question is, if this is the historical sales pattern, how can we forecast this type of sales pattern? In the first step, you could just say, well, let's look at the level. So is it a low level sales? Is it a high sales product? And then the trend. So if you just match level and trend, it's unnoticeable, but there seems to be a slightly increasing trend. Next thing we can add is like, okay, we know that on Monday we sell less, on Saturday we sell more, so we can add the day in the week. So basically, if I add the day in the week, if I know this has an impact, that's what we add to the model. The next step which we can add is like, if you talk to retailers, well, they will typically say, well, certainly the month in the year could have an influence. So maybe we will sell more in summer months compared to winter months. The week in the month can have an influence. Like retailers will tell you, like the first week of the month, typically we sell more compared to the last week in the month. That has to do with the purchasing power of the average consumer. Yeah? So people have less money to spend in the end of the month, the last week of the month compared to the first week of the month. We can also include the week, the day in the month, so we can include extra information. And yeah, we see that step by step, the forecasting model seems to more closely reflect some variance we also see in the sales pattern. And then what we did is at some point in time we also added weather information. So just look at the orange pattern. What happens if we add the weather information? that's actually what we see in this graph. So I'll just switch back and forth once more. So this is, let us say, only taking into account calendar effects. And if you then add the weather effects, then you get to this type of result. And what do we see? Well, on the one hand, we see a much better matching of some of the peaks. That's what you see. So here the peaks are not matched at all. If we switch, if we include the weather effects, you see that the peaks are matched much better. And the second thing you see is like, well, in the beginning of the year, there seems to be a continuous over forecast here. If we add the weather, you also see that that forecast is adjusted downward. So it means that some kind of how the weather seems to have an influence here on the level of the sales, and the weather certainly also seems to have an effect on the peaks. Yeah? And if I then tell you that this product is actually the sales of butter, yeah, so yeah, then I was really surprised, because this is butter, right? It's not soft drinks, it's not ice cream, or it's not swimming pools, it's just butter. And if you then understand how big is already the weather influence in a product like butter, also when I discussed with a lot of other companies, I step by step understood that a lot of companies have a big influence of weather also in their sales data. So a second remark for me was then, okay, if I see how heavily this sales pattern is influenced by weather, yeah, then I was kind of asking myself the question, how can we ever make a forecast for the sales of butter if we are not including the weather effect, right? So for this product, it's probably impossible to come to a good forecast if we don't account for the weather effect. Yeah? And this forecast is not perfect. So it's like Nikos told us, like, okay, we should try to include the relevant parameters. And we know that calendar effects play a role. We now know that weather plays a role, but there is other things to include, like holidays certainly has an effect. Promotions will have an effect. These have not yet included in the model here. So that was really my first encounter, let us say, with weather, and that's what I wanted to use as an introduction. We will look at a second example. It's again from a retail environment. It's again point of sale data. Why do we take that type of data? Because there sometimes it's most obvious that weather dependency. That's where we train our models, and those models are then also applied to business examples. That's how we work within SOLVENTURE LIFe. It's weekly sales, and we look at June, July, August for 5 consecutive years. And it's a product again with known weather dependency. So you can think about ice cream, you can think about swimming pools. We know that there is weather dependency. So the blue historical pattern here is the sales. So you see that there is summers, so to say, where the sales is a bit lower. You see that there is summers where the sales is higher, and here you really have a peak in the beginning. This is a summer where there is an early peak and then a sharp somewhere mid-peak. This is 2015. There is an extreme peak around beginning of July. 2016 again was like a bit slower summer. So if you analyze weather, there's a couple of challenges, like, yeah, how do you define weather, or what is the weather influence? Is it temperature, or does it have to do with the hours of sunshine? What is the influence of precipitation? So which one is most important? And again, if I don't want to manually select it, do I have techniques available which kind of automatically select the right weather parameter for my specific product? Because some products might even be summer products and depending on temperature or sunshine, and other products may be winter products, right? So they might rather be dependent on low temperatures or freezing, or the first winter peak, the first freezing we have in a certain region or in a certain country. So the variable selection techniques like Nikos has introduced, the lasso techniques, these will typically help us to select the relevant variables out of a broader set of weather data. A second effect, which we have not discussed yet, and which I want to highlight here, is nonlinearity. So what you also expect for a summer product is that, well, if the temperature increases from 15 degrees to 20 degrees, that will not have the same impact as seeing the temperature change from 25 degrees to 30 degrees. Yeah? And that's most clearly witnessed or shown here by that huge summer peak here in 2015. So if a couple of days you reach a very high temperature in Belgium, that would typically be like 30 degrees Celsius, then you see the effect is not linear. So if this is kind of the average sales, or if these have been the typical peaks of the last years, you see that peak here is easily a factor 4, right? So if temperature reaches certain levels, you almost have a kind of an exponential effect. It can have an exponential impact of your sales. And the big challenge is like, okay, if you don't have product at those extreme summer conditions, you will not only lose the sales for this product, but some of your customers will probably also start shopping for all of the other products at some of your competitors. So having available those weather-dependent products at those peak moments is really crucial. And having those products available really starts with making the best possible forecast. And so we know that there is a non-linearity in somewhere. And then the third specific challenge for weather is like, maybe we can model the historical weather dependency, but we certainly can't predict weather accurately 1 year ahead. We now have weather forecasts available like for the next 10 to 14 days. But even for beyond 3 to 4 days, the weather predictions are not very accurate. So if we know there is a weather dependency, but we can't predict the weather 1 year ahead, like how do we then deal with that in our forecast? So, and in the remainder of the slides, I basically want to focus on question number 2, and I want to focus on question number 3. So let's start with the non-linearity. So if you would simply build linear models, and the basic lasso, which Nikos has shown, in essence, is also starts from a linear modeling. Well, if I would model the blue heavy, let's say, summer and weather-dependent product with a linear model, you see that it fails. On the one hand, some of the peaks seem to be forecasted quite well, but for sure I don't foresee the extreme summer peak here. That's where I need the non-linearity. And I also see that this model would predict negative sales in some periods. So it means that traditional models will fail, so you need to start using nonlinear modeling. We don't want to give a course here on nonlinear modeling, but if you would do that, you see that the two things can be solved. So on the one hand, we much better match those extreme peaks. So we are much better in predicting the extreme cases of weather influence and weather dependency. And we also avoid predicting negative sales. So we only predict positive sales. So this forecast, again, is still not perfect because there's a limited number of variables going in there. We could still add promotional and other activity, which would also improve our forecast on some of the other occasions where the matching is still not yet perfect. But at least it again shows that, one, weather is non-linear, and two, you need to model it in a non-linear way, otherwise you will make grave errors. And if you don't model it, the errors will be even bigger. So that's probably what we should remember even more importantly in the end. The second question was like, okay, if I understand the weather dependency, that's good historically, but I can't predict the future, right? I can't predict weather 1 year ahead. And let's assume that I'm selling swimming pools. Well, most probably I need to import those swimming pools from China with a 3-month lead time. So even if I would know the sales 3 months or 1 month ahead, because my ordering lead time is 3 months, I will always be too late. So how do we deal with that? Well, it's not because we cannot predict the weather 1 year ahead. We still have a lot of historical weather data. And well, this is actually showing two weather elements. So on the one hand, on the horizontal axis, we have humidity. So we can have dry summers and we can have wet summers, or precipitation rather. And on the vertical axis, we have temperature. So we can have hot summers and we can have cold summers. Yeah? And you could almost divide into 4 quadrants and say, okay, we could have a hot and dry summer, we could have a hot and wet summer, we could have a cold wet summer, and we could have cold dry summers. Right? And what we can easily do is, once we have built a model that defines the dependency on precipitation and on temperature, we can easily run scenarios and we can say, okay, well, if for this product I know the weather dependency, what would the forecast look like for a hot, dry summer? And we know that 2003 was really a hot and dry summer. And what would my sales look like? What would be the forecast for a cold and wet summer like 1996 or 2011? So let's start with the first one. So if this is my historical sales, what would be the forecast for a hot and dry summer like 2003? Well, this would be my forecast if next summer would be hot and dry. What would be the forecast for a wet and cold summer? A pattern like 2011. Well, you clearly see 2011, for a wet and cold summer, the sales would be much lower. So this is hot and dry, this is wet and cold. And I can also look for the other extremes, like, okay, what would happen if I have a dry and cold summer or a hot and wet summer? Well, hot and wet summer 2006 is something like this. Cold and dry is something like this. That's 1984. So you clearly see the differences again in the level. And well, we know that the weather has an impact on the total sales. And in this situation, we only took a look at precipitation and at temperature. And what we could even do is like, okay, if we would run all of the historical summers since 1983, we could assess the impact on the future sales, assuming that we would have the identical summer period like in 1983, like in 1984, like in 1985, and so on. And what you would see as an effect is that there is a difference in the sales. So if the percentile here, the average would be 100, well, you see that sometimes the sales would go as low as 55, and sometimes the sales would go as high as 264. So this is kind of the range this product would have. It could go even low, right? So there's still a 10% chance that the actual sales is lower. This is only the 90th percentile, so there's even a 10% probability that the actual sales would be higher. There is observations in the last 30 years. We have, let's say, even more extreme weather situations. So you see that for this product, there is really a very significant weather impact. And something else you can see is that it's not symmetrical. So if we have a very cold and wet summer, the sales will be only half of, you could say, the average summer. But if we have a very good summer, well, it's not just a factor 2, it's even more than a factor 2. So it's non-linear, it's not symmetrical. In case of good weather, you could say the sales really seems to explode. That's also the huge peak we have seen in the 2015 data. And that shows that on the one hand, weather has an influence on the level of sales. Without going into the details, it's also clear that the weather also has an impact on the timing. So if you would compare 2001 and 2005, or 1999 and 2005, these are both like average summers. They are not very hot, they are not very cold, they are not extremely dry, they are not extremely wet. So if these would be average summers, if you compare the two, 2005, 99, you clearly also see here that 2005 had an early summer peak, where 99 more had a late summer peak. And if it would be, for instance, be swimming pools, most probably if you have an early summer peak, well, the buying intention or the buying willingness is still higher. If you have a late summer peak, so if it's really beginning of August, is maybe still okay, but certainly if it would be late August, well, the question is, will people still be buying swimming pools because the season is almost over? Right? That might be a different story for ice cream, but again, it's not only just about the total level of the sales, it's also about the timing of the sales and the impact the timing of the weather peak could have on your sales data. And that's still another example. You could even have multiple summer peaks. And if you look at different summers, this is only just looking at temperature. So you might need more variables than just temperature to explain the variance in your sales. Different summers will have a different behavior. And depending on your product, there may be a more important or less important impact of weather on your sales. If I have talked to multiple companies, at least I see that for a lot of product groups, a lot of companies do have significant weather impact. If you don't model it, you know it will end up in some of the other effects, like calendar effects, but the prediction will be less accurate, or the prediction could simply get you to a point where the forecast is no longer really useful. So that's probably the caveat. So a conclusion. See that we're close to the end of the webinar. Many sales patterns have weather dependency, not including the weather effects will disturb the forecast model, so you need to be aware of that. Including weather effects has some specific challenges, so what do we need? Well, SOLVENTURE LIFe on the one hand has a large set of weather variables available, and we also have powerful variable selection techniques, so we can automate that for you, or at least bring relevant suggestions which can then be manually validated by you. You need to take into account the non-linearity, so from 15 to 20 degrees does not have the same impact on your sales as going from 25 to 30 degrees. Well, we know how to model that non-linearity. And okay, we can't predict the weather 1 year ahead, but we can help you to run what-if scenarios. So what will be the sales if we have a dry, hot summer? Or what will be the sales if we have a cold, wet summer? We can give you more insight on that weather impact or weather sensitivity also towards the future, and that will typically help you to make better decisions in your S&OP process. And that's what I wanted to conclude with.